Hello everyone, and welcome back to Nailing Your Thesis, our course on how to perform research. Today we are going to continue our discussion of how to publish your research work and how publishing works and also how the publishing business works. We will next be talking about peer review, the core component of scientific quality assurance and its challenges. Here you can see a probably young researcher making a statement about the importance of peer review. Or maybe his mother is making a statement. As you can see, peer review is something that has a purpose to ensure or enable evidence-based science. And something only becomes evidence-based science in this slogan here after peer review. What is peer review? Well, it's the process of providing a quality assessment of some research work and making basically a decision about publishing or not publishing this research work. So peer review is the gatekeeper, the quality assurance mechanism by which the scientific community as a whole, the peers of science, including yourself, make a decision on the publishing worthiness and the quality of some research work. There's lots of quality assurance going on in science, of course. Peer review is the final step. It's what enables or keeps your research work from being published and being brought to the attention of other reviewers. As we have discussed already, you need to write up your work successfully and publish it, and peer review is that final step that you need to pass. The motivation from the previous figure said that or implied that peer review has a purpose, which is to enable evidence-based science. I don't know about the motivation of the prior photo, but it does tail nicely with an old notion of science, mostly known from medicine, which viewed science as eminence-based, meaning there usually was a gray-haired, typically male eminence, the expert everyone bowed to, and it was that one person's opinion that counted and determined what was considered a quality result or truth, if you will, and what not. This applied broadly, that we aren't answered to authorities, but in science we don't want to. There is no single authority that you could ultimately or should defer quality decisions to. Rather, science views quality decision-making of research work a collaborative process, and peer review is at the heart of that process. And ideally, of course, any scientific result, or by definition, if you go back to traditional methods like controlled experiments, any scientific result is based on appropriate evidence gathered through appropriate methods, as discussed many times in this course already. So let me quickly remind you or explain the peer review process before we dive into its details. There's an author or a group of authors which wrote a paper with the purpose of getting research results out to their respective scientific community. And to get them out to their community, they need to publish it. So they submit the written paper to a journal or a conference. I'm using the example of a journal here. The person at the journal who receives this paper is the editor, who has the decision-making power whether as to accept or reject that particular submission. Possibly in a series of hierarchical stages, but ultimately from an editor, he or she delegates the quality assessment, meaning the peer review work, to peer reviewers, other scientists who will read the paper, provide a quality assessment, etc., and report back to the editor. Every person involved here is displayed as a red circle, implying they're all peers. There is no assumption of someone being superior or not, but rather it's a distribution of roles. And come the next paper, roles may be reversed. The author in the first case may become a reviewer in another case, or may even be an editor in a third case. So these are roles, and the peers are considered equal contributors to the process of science. So the editor asks these reviewers, peer reviewers, for opinions, but has to aggregate them since there usually are more than one peer review, and has to aggregate them and make a decision based on possibly conflicting reviews as to whether the research work that had been submitted by the authors should be published. To the author, the review process often looks like depicted here. You have a goal. Science can be quite competitive. You want to be the first out and known for some results. So you have a goal to get your paper accepted, and on your way to that are those reviewers who will pick at the weaknesses of your paper, possibly with the goal of recommending rejection, not publication, of that journal, of that submission because of its flaws. This sounds pretty bleak, and in fact, many scientists who, as peer reviewers, will look at somebody else's research work often do take the perspective of what are the flaws. How good is the paper? Sure, but mostly how serious are any shortcomings. And any research work has shortcomings. So they will look at the shortcomings and assess the shortcomings, and based on that will form an opinion that ultimately leads to a recommendation as to whether to accept or reject a paper, as discussed in previous sessions. An editor's perspective is often somewhat different from those of a reviewer. The reviewers tend to be close to the research domain of the submitting authors. They are peers, scientific peers in that domain, and hence view things rather critically, sometimes even competitively. An editor often will ask reviewers or will look at a paper from a positive perspective, trying to find the good in there. Naturally, papers have flaws or limitations. Naturally, the reviewers will point it out, but an editor will also always know what's really good about the paper, what's novel, how is it advancing the state of the art, and is this worthy of being communicated to the scientific community, or at least those readers of the journal we use as an example here. So this is a somewhat of a cross between looking for flaws and seeing the good that warrants publication to contribute to discussion. Reviews that you might receive as a first-time author at some point of time can vary drastically. The typical heuristic is that a high-quality paper that you may have submitted warrants a lengthy or a long review in which the reviewer discusses all the positive things, but also points out limitations and actually constructively points out limitations, maybe even make suggestions on how the paper can be improved. A high-quality paper that the reviewers feel should be published should also be supported and helped and improved to some extent by reviewers. Now, many reviewers may not agree with why should I help my competitors, but that is what good science is about. There's a goal or an objective larger than your competitive stance, and high quality work should be published. Now, if you face, however, as a reviewer, a really poor paper because someone facing a publish or perish situation is trying to pull a fast one. I don't see any reason to provide a detailed review on work that should not be published anyway. You should point out the core flaws, but not provide detailed help on how to improve it. So many of this we have touched in previous sections when we talked about how to write a paper, how the process of submitting to and publishing in journals or conferences looks like. So here's a short quiz utilizing some of the frameworks from prior sessions. What do you think? Which of these two positions is better? Should an editor think it's better to reject a good paper than to accept a bad one? Or should they accept more easily? Because on the web, space is infinite. You can have as many papers and PDF out there as is possible. And ultimately, the crowd of the other scientists citing or ignoring the research work, they will sort it out for the editor. What do you think? All right. So I think both positions are valid. They align with the two independent, largely independent metrics of assessing quality research work. The first metric is, did peer reviewers think this is high quality work that needs publishing in a journal? So you do get, if you get it published, the benefit of that particular association with a journal or conference where you publish, and its reputation spills over to you, its impact factor spills over to your paper and the reputation it brings. At the same time, that is only a short-term metric because over time, indeed, high-quality citations of your paper will determine the value of your work. Whether it will get 0 citations and basically will be ignored because nobody thinks it's relevant for anything, or because it gets lots of citations, ideally high-quality citations, because people realize over time how significant the work was that you published here. Then even a lower quality journal where you may have published may not matter any longer, because now the number of citations clearly indicate the overall judgment of the scientific community. So these are two separate metrics, but they play out differently over time. If you're a young researcher, you care more about the quality of the journals and the quality assessment publishing there provides. If you are a more senior researcher, you ultimately care more about the actual impact as measured in serious citations of your work. So moving on to, if peer review is such a basic process in science, we need to look at how well it works. And there's a fair bit of criticism of peer review pointing at the various challenges it faces. So over the next few slides, let me walk you through the challenges that peer review faces in practice. Peer review starts with the peer reviewer, and there may be various challenges around an individual person providing a peer review. That other scientist a building over, or a couple of cities over, or halfway around the globe. So first of all, any particular reviewer who might be asked to provide an informed opinion, the peer review on your work as part of your submission to a journal. Any such reviewer may have a conflict of interest in a positive or a negative way. They may be inclined to help you, for example, because they work for the same institution as you, or they may even want to hinder you, maybe because they are strong competitors. In any case, any editor or program chair needs to be aware of these possible conflicts of interests, and it's usually handled in such a way that reviewers self-declare their interests, and based on those, the editor will decide whether a peer reviewer should be given a particular paper for review or not. Then a reviewer who receives a paper and who may have a negative opinion ultimately may fear retribution if the author learns about it. Remember, being a peer is a role in the scientific business, and these roles may be reversed soon. Each reviewer is also an author who submits work. And now if they fear that the author is upset with their rejection of a paper, and that author will be a reviewer next time this initial reviewer is submitting their work, they may be nicer, or they may not be accurate, or they may simply be biased in their review, and hence not provide a proper quality assessment. For that reason, almost all reviews in computer science and information systems and pretty much every other discipline are at least single-blinded. What that means is that the author will not be told who wrote these reviews. It's, say if it's 3 reviews, the author will receive a decision by an editor, and as a courtesy, the reviews will be included to justify that decision typically, but also to help the author better understand what went wrong or how to improve the paper, even if it's good and got accepted. But the reviewer names, the authors of those reviews, will not be named or will not be provided to the author. The author typically does not know who provided those reviews. As a consequence, you can often find a generic thank you at the end of research papers where the authors say, and thank you very much to the anonymous reviewers and the feedback they provided that helped us improve the paper, which is a nice note. It's not directed at anyone in particular, since they don't know who it is, and there's also nothing to be gained by it, but at least it is a clear appreciation of the value of high quality feedback in the form of peer reviews. Taking this a step further, not only may a reviewer fear retribution, leading to single blinding, a reviewer may also be biased by the names of the submitters, of the authors. If it's a very famous researcher, the reviewer may be biased along the lines of not being critical enough, because surely that famous professor does not make these simple mistakes. And hence, with such a bias, the reviews may also be less on target than they should be. In reaction to that, many journals and even conferences use double blinding. Not only, as in single blinding, will the author not know who the reviewers are, but also will the reviewers not know who the authors are. This is the second step of blinding a paper. Ideally, the reviewers have no clue whose research work they are reviewing, whether it's a famous professor or some upstart, whether it's a man or a woman, whether it's of a particular nationality or not. All of this, in the eyes of science, does not count. The work, the merits of the work, is the only thing that's relevant to science and advancing society through science. So this is tricky business. So let's walk through these different aspects in more detail. Going back to the conflict of interest, here are the rules of the DFG, the German funding agency, public funding agency for research, one of them. And these are the rules they define. Some are obvious, like your spouse or your parents or what have you should obviously not be reviewing any submission you do, whether it's a research paper or a grant proposal. Now, that's pretty much the same. Financial interests should not be given. Prior, current, or planned cooperation is a no-no, and you should be not be a reviewer of anyone's work with who you have had or will have a cooperation. And on and on. So the details of the rules don't matter here, but it's a careful delineation of when and how there might be a bias introduced by any entanglement of your interests with those of the submitting author. And if any such interests or conflicts are determined, then you're out. You should not, the reviewer should not become a potential reviewer, should not become a reviewer under these circumstances. Continuing on to single blind and double blind reviewing. Single blind reviewing is pretty common in computer science, and double blind reviewing not as much. Double blind reviewing is more common in information systems and in other traditional disciplines as well. So I think psychology, for example, being the masters of human biases, mostly has double blind reviewing. That said, it's not really necessarily easy to do double blind reviewing. The blinding of the paper can be pretty hard. It's not just that you need to remove the author names, that's the easy part, but you need to, if you are serious about it, work through the references, the wording of the paper, because there are many clues by which an author can give away who they are if the reviewer cares to track it down. As an author, you likely often write, in prior work we prove that, and that follows the reference. So if the reviewer looks up the reference, they'll right there see the names of the authors. So it's not necessarily easy to ensure double blind reviewing. Still, it's assumed mostly to help avoid any subconscious bias. Again, the famous professor might get a favorable treatment and the unknown PhD student might get a less favorable treatment than was due if you only looked at the merits of the work. The literature I'm providing for this class has the Snodgrass paper, in which the editor of computer science journal on databases discusses the advantages and disadvantages of the double blind reviewing, goes over the known research work that investigates the effectiveness of double blind reviewing, how serious the underlying biases are, and even how important just the appearance of higher fairness is. That particular article concludes that they should be introducing double blind reviewing to that particular database journal, but it remained is still not easy to do, given that the costs associated with double blinding can be substantial. It's even that some researchers will argue that they can more accurately assess a paper if they know about the authors. Now that external knowledge in the eyes of most, or in the mind of most, should not be influencing a review and a recommendation following from the review. But it's also true that possibly it will help avoid misjudgment in special cases. Anyway, computer science mostly does not double blind reviewing, but ultimately might, and information system already does so more often. So I suspect the future is double blind reviewing. Anyway, there are more problems with peer review. So, for example, an editor who picks a reviewer may pick someone who's just not competent. The reviewer itself, himself, herself, may not necessarily know that, who is willing to accept that they may not be as competent as they thought they are. And hence, a not so competent reviewer will obviously not really write a good review, nor will they provide the sufficiently informed recommendation to an editor. In fact, the one study here that I'm citing CM11 showed that the performance of reviewers decreases ultimately over time. That's not a surprise, as reviewers get older and more senior. Often more managerial tasks, say in the case of a professor, take hold, and sadly, but surely, will reduce their grip on the state of the art. So yes, it's quite common that the reviewer's performance decreases over time, which has made journals and conferences, or at least journals, starting to track the quality of reviews provided by reviewers. It's made them track those in databases so they can see if the reviewing capability of a particular person have declined too much, that maybe they should not be competent any longer for the fields they declared their interest of reviewing in. Well, beyond basic competence, a reviewer may simply be wrong. They make mistakes. They may read the paper and they may read it wrong. That's typically caught by the peer reviewing process, in that not just one peer review is being asked for, but 3 peer reviewers or more peer reviewers are asked to provide their reviews. So the editor draws on a crowd or a set of reviewers to make an opinion. Not the total crowd of the internet, but a selected few experts, usually an uneven number, and that helps avoid that a single review influences the decision too much. Now, reviewing is hard. Writing good reviews takes a lot of time. So for reasons of economic efficiency, an editor may choose to stage reviews, meaning get 2 reviews first and only ask for a third if the 2 reviews are inconclusive. If the initial 2 reviews clearly state it's a poor paper, there may not be any necessity for a third review. But this really depends on the editorial policies of a particular journal. And also it draws out the reviewing process, and that may be a problem in itself. It may be a problem because authors can choose which journals they submit to. And as they do so, some journals will get better papers and others will get lower quality papers. And certainly authors want their work to be published quickly, so authors tend to use those or submit to those journals which will turn around a decision quickly, which will publish a paper quickly. It's a competitive world, even in science, and hence editors need to manage the peer reviewing and decision-making process efficiently, and in particular make sure it doesn't drag on forever. Now, as an editor works with reviewers, selects reviewers, they may choose someone who's just overloaded. And if you're, as a reviewer, overloaded, the quality of your review may also not be very high. So here as well, the editor needs to manage the process carefully, possibly provide alternative or additional reviews. Similarly, as always, good reviewers are sought after a lot. So if you're a good reviewer, if you have a high reputation for high quality, on-time reviews, you'll be asked more and more often. And as a consequence, you will be so overloaded that you will simply say no. As a consequence, not only should editors manage the burden on your time properly by not asking you too often, there are also now ways for getting some kind of payback for the otherwise free service of reviewing that you provide. And so there are now tools and websites where you can register the reviews you have done, or the journals will do it for you, including a quality assessment, and you'll get some reputational assessment and benefits from being a reviewer too. Certainly a step in the right direction if done well. Okay, that was the part on challenges to peer review and how they can be addressed. Now, As students of our class, you read this paper, Coping with Chaos: How Disordered Context Promotes Stereotyping and Discrimination by Staple and Lindenberg. This paper, as you probably learned by now, was published in Science, a prestigious journal, so it passed peer review. But eventually it came out that all the data in there, and consequently the paper, had been fabricated. It was fraudulent research. So Science had to investigate after a whistleblower in Staples' lab pointed out that there was just some things not right. And it turned out that this particular paper and then many other papers had just been invented. So it was not proper science, it was fraudulent behavior, and it was really not good. And the particular professor here now is out of a job. So I did not expect you to recognize that this was fraudulent research, though kudos to you if you had a hunch that something might not have been proper. The lesson here was that the paper, when you read it, looks like a really well done paper. The only thing that might have upset you is that everything fit so nicely, and for example that the sample size was quite high. But ultimately you would think this is high quality research work. Just by reading the paper you could really hardly come to a different conclusion. So if you will, the internal validity of the paper was very high, but it just had no relationship with reality because it was all fabricated. So as you do peer review, or as scientists perform peer review, there are simply some limitations. Peer review is good at finding flaws or limitations and discussing its impact, but if someone really makes sure that all the T's are crossed, the I's are dotted, and it all fits together nicely, it's not impossible that fraudulent research work slips by the reviewers and gets published. Now that requires intention of researchers. In this particular case, Staple had a co-author, not even the co-author, who is supposedly a proper scientist, I have no idea, wasn't aware of it and was just collaborating, aiding the paper somehow, and wasn't aware of the data being fabricated. Beyond Staple and a set of papers, actually, as you can see here, at least 58 research papers that had to be retracted, meaning marked as fraudulent or somehow wrong. There are other people who do that as well. So here's from the website Retraction Watch, a list of the leading fraudulent researchers, well, not researchers any longer, with just sometimes a large number of fraudulent research work that got published. And still, when compared with the overall numbers of scientists, this is minuscule, but it does exist. Fraud does exist in science, and we need to catch it. And as you can see here, it ultimately got caught. So sooner or later, we will learn as to whether some research work was proper or fraudulent. And the vast majority, of course, is proper. The intentions are fine, and people are really just struggling with getting the highest quality conclusions out of their data. Now, still, the price of this fraudulent research can be high, specifically because once a paper is out there, even if it gets retracted, the way journals work, it's still there, even if there's a note that declares it as fraudulent. So some of the papers here behind this list of authors that published fraudulent research, some of these papers get cited even after a retraction had been issued, after it had been discovered it was fraudulent. In fact, the majority of citations is still for research work, of fraudulent research work takes place after it was discovered it was fraudulent. So it doesn't stop easily, and hence can be really harmful to have fraudulent research slip through and not be caught by peer review. Finally, actually science, if you will, is under attack. Here you can see a fake news website called Breitbart, which here suggests that scientists who go about the business by talking about peer review, for example, should be murdered. So reaching for your Browning means reaching for your gun, presumably shooting the scientist who talks about peer review. This website is noteworthy because of its founder, one Steve Bannon, who is now the strategic advisor to the 45th president of the United States. And I surely do hope that his website, this website that he founded, is not indicative of the future treatment of scientists by the US administration. In any case, what's wrong here is that you may be critical of peer review and point out challenges to it, but let me say it with by rephrasing or reframing Churchill talking about democracy. Peer review really is the worst quality assurance measure we have in science, except for all the others. We simply don't have anything better. And it certainly is better to have a peer-based, multiple people-based, defined and rigorous process that science and publishers are continuously striving to improve than, say, to go back to some sort of eminence-based science where we have single gray eminences that make decisions. Science has clearly evolved from that Middle Age model to one of accountability with peer review at its heart to make sure that science, which is and will always be a social process, gets to the highest quality decisions it can and at a given point of time. Such decisions may be reverted later as more knowledge is being established, but in the given point of time that we are facing, peer review certainly today is the best quality assurance measure we have. So this then is what I talked about in this session: peer review as a quality assurance measure of science, the various problems and challenges it faces and the answers that we have found in science, and also some of the tougher problems that we need to come by but usually do, for example, uncovering fraudulent research, as well as struggling with the use or abuse of science for particular political goals. Science tries to discover some universal truth. It's hardly ever universal, as we never know how our expanding knowledge will revise prior knowledge, but it certainly has to be people and conflict free, ideally, and this is what the peer review process of quality assurance of science is supposed to enable, and thus, at least, is the best of the processes we know that achieves this goal. That's it from me for now, and see you